Many centuries ago, in the distant lands of Albania, there dwelt a princess by the name of Marigo. Now, Marigo was, at least in the eyes of her parents, quite astoundingly beautiful. Maybe others would have had a less starry-eyed view of her, but to her mother, her father, the king and the queen, she was perfection itself. And the mother particularly doted on her daughter in every regard. She bathed her, she dressed her, she fed her, she gave her everything the daughter ever asked for, including, which was unusual at that time, an education. And in order to provide her daughter with an education, she scoured the land for a governess who would not merely teach her daughter to sew and embroider and do the usual things that princesses are expected to do, but would educate her in literature and science and religion and politics and all of the things that Marigo expressed an interest in learning about. And after much searching, she did indeed find a governess who was knowledgeable in all of these things. And the woman came, and she doted upon Marigo as much as the queen doted upon Marigo. Each morning, the young girl would wake up, and her mother would bathe her and dress her and feed her and prepare her for the day, and off she'd be back to school with the governess, and there she would learn about nature, or about astronomy, or about mathematics, or about geography, or about politics, or about 101 other subjects. And at the end of the day, the governess would bathe her, wash her clothes, dry her clothes, dress her back up again so she looked neat, and all of the chalk marks and the ink spots and the chemical stains from the days they were doing chemistry, and the mud stains from when they were out doing botany in the garden, and all the various different marks that come with a day of industrious education were washed away, and she could return to her mother and father resplendent and looking suitably like a princess. And this continued for some years. Marigo grew, and she grew to love her governess with just as much devotion, as much daughterly love as she felt for her own mother. And one day, Marigo was reaching the end of her school day, and the governess said to her, "Tell me, if you could choose who to go home to, would you go home to your mother, the queen, or would you go home to me and have me as your mother?" And Marigo was in two minds, because, as I say, she loved her governess as much, really, as she loved her own mother. And she didn't want to hurt the governess's feelings by saying, "Oh no, my mother," every time. And so she said, "Well, I found it hard to choose, but I do love you as a daughter should love her mother. You are so wise and so learned and so knowledgeable about the world, and so patient and so kind and so noble," and 101 other things that she heaped praise upon the governess. And so the governess said, "Well, my dear, should you ever wish to be rid of your mother, here is what you must do." And the governess, who you may gather was not as nice inwardly as she was outwardly, who had what we these days might say groomed Marigo for all of these many years, preparing her mind for the day when she herself would seek to instigate the next stage of her plan, she instructed Marigo in what to do. "There is in the palace, you have told me about it many times," said the governess, "a great stone chest in which succulent fruits are kept cool by the coldness of the stone. Ask for your mother to fetch you some figs, some grapes, some strawberries, some succulent fruits from the stone chest. And if she rings the bell to summon the maids to fetch them, say, 'No, mother, no, let us go together, mother and daughter, and you may select such fruits as you would like to give me from the chest.' And when you get to the chest, if the maids rush up to open the chest lid for you, send the maids away. and say, no, 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 I will open the chest for my mother that she may look inside. And when your mother bends over to look into the chest full of fruits and delicacies, you must slam that stone lid shut upon her head and break her neck. Oh, why would I do that? Said Marigo. Well, you see, my child, after a proper period of mourning, when your father has grieved for the loss of his wife, why, he will want to remarry. And who should he remarry but me? I am already as a mother to you. I can become fully your mother when I marry your father. But to marry your father, he must first be a widower. And so Marigo, and you might wish otherwise, but such is the nature of the tale, Marigo went home thinking about this and thinking about this. All through the weekend, when of course there is no school, she thought about this. And Monday morning, when she awoke and her mother bathed her and dressed her and was about to serve her breakfast, Marigo said, Mother dear, I should like some figs and some strawberries and some delicacies from the stone chest. And the mother went to ring the bell for the maids, and Marigo said exactly as the governess had instructed her, no, no, let us go together as mother and daughter. And so they went down to the kitchens, and there in the cool parlour beside the kitchen where they stored the perishable foods, there was the great stone chest. And again, a maid rushed in to open the chest, and the daughter, just as the governess had instructed, sent the maid away, saying, no, 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 I will do this for my mother. I will open the chest for her, and she will choose such fruit as she would like me to have. And the queen bent over to look at the strawberries and the figs and the grapes and the dates and all of the other exotic things that they had stored in the stone chest, as Marigo was holding that great heavy stone lid up, and as soon as the mother's head was over the rim, she dropped it, slammed it, and the great stone lid crashed down on top of the queen's head, snapped her neck, very nearly took her head completely off her shoulders. And at once Marigo screamed and wailed and wept, and perhaps they were genuine tears of regret, or perhaps she was just a bit of a sociopath who was putting it on for a show, who knows. But she wept and she wailed and she wailed and she wept, and everyone said what a terrible accident it must be that this princess, and we all know that princesses are not built for strong manual labour like holding up heavy stone lids. That's a job much better suited to some big brawny kitchen maid who has spent her life fetching and carrying and chopping and scrubbing and building up her muscles. She must have lost her grip upon the stone lid, and a terrible thing it was. And a year passed, a year of mourning and grieving, and during this year, whilst her father mourned and grieved, and to some extent Marigo mourned and grieved, she still kept up her lessons with the governess, until at the end of the 12 months the governess said to her, just as she was getting ready to return to the palace from the schoolroom, I think it is time that you spoke to your father about remarriage, and suggest to him that instead of turning to some princess from a foreign kingdom to become his new wife, or some duchess, or some countess, he should turn to me. And when Marigo got home, she broached the subject with her father, and he said yes, he had been thinking that maybe after a year of mourning he should consider taking a new queen, and he began to talk about this countess and that duchess and some other princess, and at once Marigo said, no, 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 father, wouldn't it be so much better if you married a woman who is already to me like a mother? And she sung the praises of the governess, how clever she was, how brave she was, how learned she was about politics and the ways of the court, how beautiful she was, how caring she was, and all the rest of it. And the father was not overly enamoured at the prospect, for whilst the governess was a descendant of a noble family, because clearly they wouldn't take on board a peasant to teach their daughter, she was nonetheless a very minor member of the gentry, and the king had his sights set on someone further up the aristocratic ladder. But Marigo, day after day, night after night, worked upon her father at the governess's behest, until eventually the father relented and said, "Look, look, my daughter, on the day my shoes turn red, I will consider marrying the governess." And the very next day, Marigo told the governess what her father had said, and on her way home, the governess presented Marigo with a bottle of red ink and said, "You know what to do." And when Marigo got home that day, she waited for her father to fall asleep by the fireplace, as was his wont. And as he snored in his favourite armchair, she took the red ink and a little brush and delicately painted his shoes, so that when he awoke the next morning, he saw by the light of dawn that his shoes were red. And Marigo rushed out early and said, "Look, father, look, your shoes are red. You said when your shoes turned red, you would consider marrying the governess." And the father, slightly suspicious, said, "Yes, I did say that. And I will say this to you. When my robe, my splendid robe, when this is moth-eaten and full of holes," which of course it never would be, because it would be thrown out long before it got to that state. "When my robe is full of moth holes and chewed up, then I will consent to marry this wretched governess." And off Marigo popped to school, and she told the governess, and the governess said, "Well, when you return home, take this pair of scissors with you, and you know what to do." And off Marigo popped home, and again she waited for her father the king to fall asleep in his red shoes in front of the fireplace. And when he was snoring like a good one, she produced the scissors and snip, 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 snip. She cut dozens of tiny little holes in her father's robe in such parts of it as she could reach, with him still wearing it and asleep in the chair. And when he awoke by the dawn light, he stood up and he looked at his robe with a dozen holes here and a dozen holes there, and at once Marigo ran in and said, "Father, father, look, your robe is full of holes. It is a sign the gods wish you to get married, and they wish you to marry the governess." And at length the father, who perhaps was not the strongest of characters, relented, and the wedding was arranged. And the governess became the new queen. And at once, of course, the lessons stopped. For why would a queen want to bother herself with the work of a schoolmarm when she has a kingdom to rule over and supermarkets to open and babies to kiss? And Marigo felt a little neglected, but she appreciated that her new stepmother had many duties upon her shoulders to fulfill. The years rolled past, and Marigo grew and grew into womanhood, grew to an age where her father and her stepmother were starting to think that maybe she should be married off, except that isn't really what her stepmother was thinking. Her stepmother was thinking how disturbingly beautiful Marigo had become, and how clever she had become, for though they had left off the lessons once she had married the king, Marigo had continued to educate herself in the palace library, reading book after book after book, and discussing all manner of topics with the alchemist, with the farrier, with the viziers of the court, with the wise and the learned men and women of the court. And the stepmother felt that it was inadvisable to have a stepdaughter who was both very clever, very determined to pursue knowledge at all costs, and very beautiful, beautiful enough to attract the most daring, bravest, handsome princes in the land who would want to become her husband. And at length she said to her husband one night, as they lay together in the royal bedchamber, "I have had a dream." Now, she often had dreams, and these dreams often turned out to be very wise dreams. and her husband had come to rely upon the wisdom of her dreams. Or at least when I say she had these dreams, that's what she told her husband. For when she had sudden ideas for policies at court and understandings of the politics between this kingdom and the other kingdoms, rather than telling her husband her opinions, she would always present it as a visionary dream, for he was superstitious enough to believe in visionary dreams with a fervour and a conviction that he would have been less likely to show if it was simply his wife dispensing her opinion. And so she said to him, "I have had a dream. And in this dream, I and Marigo were both gravely ill." And the father began to chew his fingernails, for he dreaded the loss of both his wife and his daughter. And a voice spoke to me from the heavens, a voice boomed down to me from the heavens in the dream, in the vision, and said that only one of us could live. Either I would die and Marigo would live, or Marigo would die and I would live. But we cannot both live together for more than one more month. And if at the end of that one more month a decision has not been made, then we will both die. Well, the king was beside himself with grief. He tossed and turned all night, tormented by this dream. And in the morning, when the stepmother awoke, she turned to him, bleary-eyed and baggy, big bags under his eyes and bloodshot, and said, "Husband, have you made a decision?" And the husband said, "Well, we must consult with the wisest in the land. We must get priests. We must get wizards. We must get soothsayers in." No, said the stepmother. "Have you made a decision about which of us will live and which of us will die? Or do you prefer to let both your wife and daughter die at the same time, as per my vision? And you know from the past that my visions have always been strong ones and wise ones and true ones." Well, the king couldn't face the death of his wife, but equally he couldn't face the death of his daughter. And what a decision to have to make, to choose one or the other, to consign one to the grave that the other might live. And for the next 3 weeks his wife went on and on and on at him. Did he not love her? Did he not care for her? Did she not advise him and guide him and counsel him and do this and do that? And every time he sought to get advice from a wizard, from a priest, from a vizier, she would say, "You do not believe my dreams, you do not trust me, you seek the guidance of foolish men and foolish women, you'd sooner trust their word than my word," and on and on and on and on she went, until she wore him down. And at length he said, all right, I will choose, as any husband must choose, you, my wife. My daughter Marigo must die, she must perish that you might live." And for the first time in 3.5 weeks, a smile spread across the sour countenance of the queen. "How will you do it?" she said at once, giving him no chance to sit and change his mind. I cannot kill her here," he said. I can't bring myself to lift a weapon against her or poison her or do any of the things that you have been suggesting these last few weeks. I cannot bring myself to do it in her own home." "Then take her away somewhere else and do it there, but do it, and do it quickly, for we only have a matter of days before the month is up, and we will both die." And so the very next day, the king, with a heavy heart, had the servants prepare a picnic basket and had the lads in the stables bring out a horse and said to Marigo, "Get upon the horse with me and we will ride off into the mountains and we will have a picnic together like we used to do when you were very young." And Marigo, trusting and innocent, went off with him, and they rode mile after mile after mile until they were a long way from home up the mountains. And there they came to a cliff and dismounted the horse and laid out the picnic blanket and the food from the basket. And looking over the cliff, the king saw a river, a great torrent of a river, many feet down below. And he said to his daughter, "Do you love me?" And his daughter said, well, of course I do. Do you love me enough to help me with something? I said, well, of course I do. What help do you need? And the king took a flask of wine that the servants had put in the basket, and he tossed it over the cliff, and it went down and down and down and down into the river. And the river washed the flask of wine up upon the banks of the river. And the king said to her, will you go and fetch me the flask of wine and bring it back up here to me, to prove how much you love me? And the daughter, rolling her eyes and thinking her father had lost the plot entirely, said, of course, father, though it would have been better if you hadn't chucked it in the first place. But down she went, down she went, down she went. And it was a long, steep, difficult climb, and she was not dressed for it. She was dressed as princesses are, in great flowing gowns and fancy shoes that are not best suited for scrabbling down cliff faces, let alone scrabbling back up them with a flask of wine under one armpit. And when finally she got back to the top, and it must have been an hour or more later to get down and back up again, her father was gone. The horse was gone. The only thing left was the picnic laid out on the blanket. The father rode back to the palace and told his wife that Marigo was dead, that he'd shoved her in a river and she'd drowned and washed away. And it was announced to the court that the Princess Marigo had drowned in a river, and there was a day of national mourning. But of course she hadn't. She was still sitting there on the picnic blanket, weeping and wailing and wondering what on earth had become of her father and of the horse and what was going on. And she was so many miles away from home, and she didn't know what to do. When at length she heard singing, three women's voices raised in song, and she looked up around her and she could see nobody in the hills, and she could see nobody in the mountains or down below in the woods. She looked over the cliff, and there were three wondrous women sitting on the banks of the river, their feet in the waters, sunning themselves on a boulder. And Marigo called out, and the women waved up at her and beckoned her to come on down. And so for the second time that day, Marigo had a dangerous scrabble down the hillside, and there she met these three strange women, the goddesses of the river. And Marigo told them what had happened, and the goddesses listened and said, your father seeks to protect you as best he may, though your father is weak, and you must not trust him. You must trust your stepmother even less. You must not go back to the palace, for if you do, you will die. Then what am I to do? Said Marigo. Where should I go? Where must I live? How will I survive? And the goddesses said, if you follow this river down 1.5 miles, you will come to a great castle, built on top of a mountainside with many caves and tunnels within the mountain. And within the castle and within the caves and the tunnels there dwell 40 dragons. That castle is their home. These 40 dragon brothers who have lived there hundreds of years, for dragons live a very long time. But they live in chaos, for they are not well suited to life in a castle. Once these brothers were humans, but now they are enormous dragons as a result of a spell put on them, and they can scarcely manage to cope within this castle. Go to this castle, hide yourself during the daytime, and in the night try to tidy the place up a bit. And Marigo thought, well, she was a princess, what on earth did she know about cooking and cleaning and scrubbing? She never lifted a broom in her life, but at least it will be shelter. But hide yourself during the day, for the dragons will not know what to make of you. And do this for as long as you can. You will be able to feed yourself from their pantry. You will be able to warm yourself with blankets from their beds. You look after them and they will look after you. And we will see what we will see. And the women dived back into the river and disappeared into the waters. When the goddess is gone, Marigo had no choice but to walk the 1.5 miles down the length of the river, and indeed she could see up ahead, after a mile or so, that castle in the distance, and it got closer. She got closer and closer to it. And when she arrived, it was getting very dark, and she snuck her way into the castle. It wasn't guarded. There were no guards. With 40 dragons there, who needs guards? So she was able to make her way into the castle. And it was exactly as the river goddesses said. It was thick with dust and cobwebs and clutter here and clutter there. Oh, it was a terrible mess. And tired though she was after a day of hiking up and down cliffsides and wandering along riverbanks, she sat to. She found some food in the kitchen. She fed herself. She scrubbed the pots and pans as best she could, although that wasn't particularly good. She never having done a hand's turn in her life and having none of the skills needed to look after a home, but she did her best. Until she felt so tired that she found a cupboard and hid herself in the bottom of it and fell asleep there. And in the morning she heard the growling and the roaring of the dragons as they woke up, and they began lumbering about the place, all 40 of them. And she could hear the amazement as they discussed with each other how much tidier the kitchen looked, and one brother said to another, "Did you do it? No. Did you do it? No. Did you do it? No." And they came to the realization that some wondrous being had cleaned the kitchen in the night. "Well," they said, "perhaps we are blessed with a house fairy, a house sprite. If we could but meet this spirit, we could make them, well, if it is a young woman, we will make her our sister. If it is an old woman, we will make her our mother. If it is a man, we will make him our brother. And they will live with us openly, and we will embrace them." "Yes," agreed all of the dragons. This is what we should do." And one of the dragons said, "I will keep watch. I will keep watch in the night and see if I can spot this mystery person who has cleaned our kitchen." Well, the dragon did his best to keep his eyes propped open during the night, but he soon fell asleep. And Marigo snuck out, and having cleaned the kitchen, she then moved on to clean a different room of the house, and left the dragon brother snoring in the kitchen. Off she went, and the next day the dragons awoke, and they saw not only was the kitchen still clean, but now the library was also clean and dusted. And again they were amazed, and a different dragon brother took a turn to keep watch that night in the library. But of course Marigo didn't go to the library because she'd already cleaned that. She went to one of the bedrooms and cleaned that instead, and this continued for 40 nights, until room after room after room in the castle was clean. Until on the 40th night, with all of the rooms in the castle suitably cleaned, Marigo had nowhere to go but back to the kitchen. And the 40th dragon brother had guessed that this might happen, and so was awake in the kitchen and saw her emerge from a cupboard, and at once called to the other dragons, and they all turned up and they embraced Marigo. They thanked her, they heaped praise upon her for looking after their house, for being so industrious and kind and considerate and caring, and said no, she must, instead of just hiding away in cupboards, she must have a room of her own, and they heaped clothes upon her that had once belonged to their own sister, and jewels upon her that had once belonged to their own sister, and they treated her like a princess once again. And for several months, Marigo and the 40 dragon brothers lived very happily together. Meanwhile, back in the original palace, the governess turned queen awoke. All seemed right in her world. She had her husband completely under her thumb. She had the kingdom completely in her grip. Not a problem in the world. And she went out that morning, and it was a lovely sunny day, and she strode in the rose garden, and she looked up at the sun and said, "Father Sun, am I not the happiest person in the kingdom? Am I not the fairest woman in the land?" And Father Sun looked down and said, "You may be the most contented person in this kingdom, but you are not the fairest in the land, for there is another fairer than you." And the queen said, "Who on earth could that be? Who could be fairer than me? I bathe in oil of Ulay every night. Who could possibly be fairer than me?" And father-son said, "Why, your stepdaughter Marigo, she lives with the 40 dragons in the great castle in yonder kingdom, and she is happy and joyful and beautiful, and her contentment shines through and makes her even more beautiful than she would be normally." And the queen, she ranted, she raged, she stomped, she called imprecations to her husband and berated him and nagged him and nagged him and nagged him, and eventually the husband broke down and admitted that he had let Marigo go down the mountainside towards the river and had run off without waiting to see if she had indeed fallen in the river and drowned. He had just assumed she was dead. And the queen said, "Well, you must make sure, you must go to this castle where these 40 dragons live, and you must present Marigo with," and she looked around her bedchamber and she snatched up some hairpins, and she snatched a bottle off the shelf and she began to dip the hairpins in the liquid in the bottle, and then placed them in a box and presented them to her husband. "Take these hairpins, give her one, and let her put it in her hair. They are poisonous. The mere touch upon her skin will be enough to kill her completely." But you can't expect me to kill my own daughter. I expected you to do it before, and you said you had done it. You were willing to do it then. You must be willing to do it now. All this kingdom will crumble. I have had a vision. This kingdom will crumble, and you will die, and I will die, and all will die. Do you wish the death of everyone in this kingdom, including your own wife? Or will you get rid of that wretched daughter of yours? Well, it took only 3 more days of relentless demanding and threats before eventually the king succumbed, and he donned the disguise of a merchant, travelled across the land to where the castle of the dragons was, and presented himself as a merchant. Marigo came down. It had been a long time since she'd seen another human being, and she didn't recognise her father, so good was the disguise and the funny voice that he put on. And he said, I come selling goods for beautiful women like you. Will you not buy my goods?" And he laid out all manner of things that he'd picked up round the palace to bring with him as part of his disguise. And Marigo looked at this. "Oh no, I've got one of them. Oh, I've got 3 of those. Oh no, my new brothers have given me 5 of them. I definitely don't need any more of that." And at length the merchant, so-called, produced the box with the hairpins in and said, "There, do you have hairpins?" And Marigo had to admit that she didn't have any hairpins. Buy these. And he sold them to her for a very low price. And Marigo went into the castle, went to her room, sat before the mirror, adjusted her hair, stuck in a hairpin, and just as she was reaching for a second hairpin, she keeled over dead. Such was the poison. And her father, heavy-hearted, went back to the kingdom to tell his wife that his daughter was well and truly dead this time. The 40 dragon brothers returned from their day's adventures, and they called into the castle for Marigo, and normally she would come running and they'd have food together and share tales of their day together, but of course she did not come running. And the dragon brothers went up to her room, and one of them, you can only fit 1 dragon in a bedroom at a time, could get in, and he found her dead upon the floor and picked up the body, weeping and wailing, carried it down to show to his other brothers, and they wept and they wailed and they grieved, and they were just wondering what they ought to do. Should they bury her? Should they cremate her? What should they do with her? When the sharpest-eyed of the 40 dragon brothers noticed the hairpin, and he said, "That did not belong to our sister of yesteryear. We did not give that to Marigo." And he reached in with his enormous claws and plucked the hairpin out, and was looking at it and sniffing it and said, This is poison." But in the minutes after he had drawn the pin out, Marigo began to reanimate and was restored to life. And she told the tale of the merchant who had arrived and sold her these hairpins. And they looked in the box with all the other hairpins in the box, and the dragons sniffed the hairpins and said, all of these are poisoned. Someone has tried to murder you. This merchant, this wicked merchant has tried to murder you. And they threw the hairpins on the fire and incinerated them. You must promise us not to buy stuff. If you need hairpins, tell us and we will get you hairpins. If you need anything, tell us and we will get it to you. We've given you everything that was once our sisters. We are happy to go to the market and bring you back anything you require that you cannot find in our sister's old room. And for a few more days all was happy, until the Queen, back at the palace, awoke once more on a lovely sunny day and went out into the garden and stretched and yawned and inhaled the scent of the roses and called up to Father Sun and said, am I not the most contented woman in this kingdom? Am I not the fairest? And Father Sun said, well, you might be the most contented, love, but you're not the fairest, for Marigo still lives. And she is so happy and content, it radiates through her and shines from her. Well, the Queen screamed, she raged, she roared, and this time it took her only a day and a half of relentless badgering to convince her husband to go back and do properly what he had failed to do. And this time she looked around her boudoir and snatched up a box of rings which the king had presented to her at various points in the preceding duration of their marriage, and she took the same bottle of poison and she dipped each ring in the bottle of poison and returned it to the chest, gave it to her husband and said, give her one of these, it doesn't matter which one she likes, give her one, they're all poisoned, that will polish her off completely. And this time the king changed his disguise so he looked like a completely different merchant, went off to the castle of the dragons, his heart heavier than ever it had been, and called up to the mistress of the castle, would you like to buy my goods? And she came down and she looked at them and said, well, my brothers have said I must not buy things. Oh, but I am so poor, I go from village to village and nobody wants to buy my goods, I will starve. Well, said Marigo, I will feed you. No, said the merchant, I cannot take food without first making a trade. But I'm not allowed to buy anything. My brothers don't want me to buy anything because of what happened last time I bought something. Well, I'll tell you what, said the merchant. If you offer me food, rather than giving it to me for free, I will swap you a ring for the food. That is a fair exchange, and you will have done nothing that your brothers have forbidden you for doing. They said you cannot buy anything. This is trade. This is not buying. This is barter. And Marigo had to admit that, yes, it was barter and not a sale. And so she presented the merchant with a plate full of food. And he gave her the box of rings and she looked at them and she took them out and tried them on until she found one that fitted. And as soon as it fitted upon her finger, she killed over dead. And her father checked her pulse, saw that she was indeed lifeless, and with a heart so heavy it nearly broke there and then, he made the journey back to tell his wife what had happened and present her with the remaining rings in the box. Well, the dragon brothers came back. They looked her up and down, they wept, they wailed, they sobbed, their hearts heaved, they searched her hair for hatpins and hairpins and they could find none. She was dead and they didn't know what to do. Sad to say, the sharp-eyed brother had not noticed the ring upon Marigo's finger. And they discussed over the next couple of days whether to bury her or burn her or cremate her and what to do. And at length the brothers created a coffin. They made it with their magic, being dragons, and they encrusted this coffin with pearls and rubies and diamonds and emeralds and sapphires. They made the most magnificent and beautiful coffin ever with a glass lid, and they laid Marigo out in it, and they worked their magic, their dragon magic, around the body of Marigo that it should never decay. She should remain as perfect in the coffin 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now, as the day in which she was laid into the coffin. And they debated where to bury her, and at length they reached a decision. They flew, these dragons, the 40 dragons, they flew to a neighbouring kingdom, where the king had a great garden. And at one side of the garden there was a magnificent tree, huge, enormous tree. And the dragons took the coffin and they laid it at the base of the tree. And then they flew off back to their own castle, their hearts heavy. And the next morning, for the dragons had arrived in the night, the next morning the gardener came out and was pruning the roses and chanced upon the coffin, and, well, he didn't know what to do. He rushed into the palace. He told everyone he could find to tell, and eventually word reached the king that there was this magnificent bejewelled coffin with this beautiful woman in it and a glass lid laying in the garden underneath the tree. And out he went to look, and he well, he didn't know what to make of it. It was the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. Not only was the coffin a work of absolute art, but the woman within it was beautiful. Stone cold dead, but beautiful. He had the coffin brought in to the house. He had servants and messengers travelling the length and breadth of the land to find out if anyone knew who this woman was, who'd put the coffin there, where she'd come from, how she died. Nobody knew. It was a mystery. Eventually he had the coffin moved from the great chamber of the palace up into his own bedroom. And from the day the coffin had been found, the king stopped eating. He hardly drank anything. He grew thinner and thinner. And the servants would often find him sitting in his bedroom in a chair, staring into the coffin, staring through the glass lid at this perfect, beautiful woman who didn't decay, who didn't wither away like any normal corpse would, but lay there in state. Gruesome as it may be to say it, he had fallen in love with this vision of perfection, even though she was dead. And the fact that she was dead, that the grief was heavy upon him, weighed very heavily on him. He couldn't eat, he could barely drink, he hardly slept, he got iller and iller and iller, thinner and thinner and thinner. He looked terrible, as she looked perfect. And eventually word reached the king's old mother, off in her own palace, many a mile away. And the mother of the king came to visit and looked at her son, saw how thin he was, how ill he was, the enormous bags under his eyes, and consulted with the servants in the castle and the advisors, and they said, well, the tale of the coffin and the mysterious woman and the fact that her son spends half his time now just sitting staring at the woman in the coffin. She thought this all very unhealthy and very disturbing and very odd, and she went to look at the woman in the coffin and said she was indeed beautiful, but really, just sitting and staring at a corpse day after day, week after week, month after month was deeply unhealthy. Something would have to be done. And at first she spoke to her son about burying the coffin, as coffins should be, but her son would have none of it. And there was a need to liaise with the neighbouring kingdom, the kingdom that was ruled over by the 40 dragons. And this was something that the king's mother spoke to her son about and said he really should go and speak to the dragons about the diplomatic issues of trade that were becoming awkward, difficult. It was his job. He had to tear himself away, at least for a few hours, from the woman in the coffin to go and attend to the affairs of states, and off he went. And as soon as this contrivance had been organised, the queen, the elderly queen, the king's mother, called for the servants and had them carry the coffin down to the kitchens where the great enormous bread ovens were, in which they baked hundreds and hundreds of loaves and rolls a day to feed all of the nobility and the servants and everybody else within the castle. And she had them open the doors, and great heat swept out. And she said to her lady-in-waiting, if we have this coffin buried, as soon as we are gone from this place, my son will have it dug back up again and brought to his room. He's obsessed with this dead woman. It's better that we get rid of the body entirely. And so, at her instructions, the servants lifted the body out of the glass coffin. And the Queen said, place it in the oven. I don't wish to watch, and I don't wish to smell that body burning, but place it in the oven. When it's incinerated, make sure you sweep out all of the ashes before any bread is baked in that oven again. And off she swept back upstairs, for this was the first and last time she'd ever been in her kitchen. And the servants were about to chuck the body in the oven, when one of the maids said, well, she's got all of these jewels on her. Should we not take them off? I mean, they must belong to some relative of this dead woman. Someone or another will want their inheritance. We shouldn't just chuck them all in the oven and incinerate them. And so they began to take off the necklaces, and take off the bejewelled hairpins and all of the rest of it. And eventually the ring was removed. And as soon as the ring was removed, Marigo began to awaken again. And she looked around herself and, where on earth am I? Who are these people? Why is there a roasting hot oven open? Where am I? What's going on? And the servants, bewildered, horrified, was this a vampire, a zombie, a thing risen from the grave? But no, she was warm, and she was standing in sunlight. She couldn't be a vampire. She appeared to have no great appetite for eating people's brains. She couldn't be a zombie. She reassured them that no, she was alive. She had a pulse, a heartbeat. Well, the servants rushed upstairs to fetch the elderly Queen. And the woman from the coffin was shown up with her jewellery restored to her, but she made a point of taking the ring as soon as it was presented to her and throwing it in the oven to incinerate in there rather than putting it back on. She was shown up into the presence of the ancient Queen, who looked her up and down in amazement and listened to Marigo's tale of all that had befallen her. And scarcely had she finished that tale than the doors opened and the king returned from his diplomatic mission. He clapped eyes on the woman he recognised instantly from having spent months and months staring at her in a glass coffin. He was already in love with the inanimate body, and now she spoke, and she had a beautiful voice, and she was clever, and she was wise, and she was filled with stories and tales, and one thing, of course, led to the obvious other, and in due course they were married, and Marigo lived happily to the day of her death. And as much as I'd like to tell you of the awful fate that befell the governess, her stepmother, and maybe what happened to those poor dragons, sadly, the story does not account for any of that. But at least Marigo and the new king were happy.